Hello and welcome to Letters from Ghana, a vlog series that seeks to share my experiences about Ghana, the realities about the African continent, and my living experience in the UK. So almost a year ago, I left my home country, Ghana, to pursue a master's degree here in the UK, and it's been 11 months filled with interesting and fascinating experiences. I remember the look on my landlord's face when I was moving into my new apartment. It was clear that somehow he assumed that I could not afford to pay the rent. And so he kept asking questions about my source of income, essentially wondering how I could afford to pay for the rents for that apartment. Now, he also assumed that I could not fix the blinds in the room. And so he looks to me and says to me, I understand that the rent is expensive. Somehow wondering if I would continue from there. And I'm sure he was very surprised when I stared straight back at him. I admit I was very confused initially. So I wondered what my parents' profession or where I came from had to do with fixing the damaged blinds or paying for the apartments. But by the end of our conversation, I realized that something was clear. He had never traveled to my home country, Ghana, or any other parts of Africa for that matter, but for some reason he felt some kind of sympathy for me. And so since that experience, I felt challenged to correct some of the misconceptions about the people of Ghana, about the African continent, which in most cases are presented in one news, books, or some form of media or the other. Now, as the second largest continent in the world, Africa has a population, as at 2016, it's pegged around 1.2 billion people. And so what happens if the story of the lot is not fully told? What happens if you are made to believe that Africa and Africans are filled with starved children, abject poverty? We come from a culture of storytelling. We are storytellers, but unfortunately we are unable to tell the rest of the world our story. Oral tradition has been the way we've passed stories from one generation to the other. It's the way we've shared our rich culture heritage, like the talking drums of the Ghana's Ashanti Kingdom. But unfortunately, the sounds of the drums cannot go far, cannot reach across Africa into Europe, and for that matter, America. And that is why I'm here to present to you a letter from Africa, from West Africa, the land of my birth. I seek to find out if these negative images is really as a result of the Western media representation. Why the Western media, for example, portrays Africa and Africans the way that they do. What Africans and non-Africans think about the continent, and also answer the question of whether or not African media is telling the African story enough to project the pertaining realities of our continent. Now, in 2001, the Live Aid Legacy reported that in their report by the VSO, page 3 to be specific, on looking at the developing world through the British eyes, came up with some key findings. Now, two among the lots were striking. The report established that 80% of the British populace associated developing world with doom-laden images of famine, disaster, and war, Western aid. Now, the report also defined British relationship with the developing world, describing Britain as the benevolent givers and developing world as a grateful receivers. Now, a little further on in that same report, on page 15, also states that many UK media consumers retain an essentially one dimension of view of what Africa is about, of what developing countries talk about or do. And it said that the stereotypes are primarily driven by images of drought and famine in African countries. Now, stories like this have been around for ages, decades, centuries. The accounts of English naturalist Charles Darwin, who described the continent as dark, formed the basis of what would come to stay with the African continent for a very long time. Now, that's not to say that some parts of Africa do not experience conflict and poverty. Yes, some parts of the African continent do. But countries such as Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana have, a lot of beautiful stories that we could equally share. We are vibrant cocoa producers, and there's a booming oil industry in Nigeria, and this could be another side to the story. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are the highest cocoa producers in the world, and we continue to serve the world with best cocoa. And so for every bit of delicious bar of chocolate you take, could be possibly a very good cocoa seed, possibly coming from Ghana. Now, author Susan Moeller, in her book in 1999, Compassion and Fatigue, also explains how the media sell disease and famine, war and death to the understanding that the media in America is responsible for promoting crisis and disasters by reporting using some stereotypes and sensationalism to hold the attention of their audiences. So in 2002, Mishara in 2002 shared a similar view when she said that most Western media outlets, due to a drive for profit, end up shaping the world events in commercial interest. And this is to say that most Western media outlets select stories that are profit-oriented and can sell. So clearly, it does not matter if developing countries such as Ghana and other countries have become vulnerable in the eyes of these big media giants. But you see, the media is a powerful tool, and our words are that which is capable of projecting the words of our mouth are even a much more bigger tool. And so one of the lessons that have really stuck with me from long in high school was when a lecturer was teaching me on advertising and the essence of repetition. The focus was on the impact of repeating messages on human, saying it again and again places an emphasis. Repeating it eventually makes you achieve the desired effect on the recipient of the message. So the other day I listened to Akon speech, American-born Senegalese singer and songwriter. I'm sure most of us can relate to his works. And as he spoke on branding, he emphasized that you can make anything the best you want if you are able to brand, if you're able to tell your own stories, redefine how people see you, think about you, your country, your continent. And essentially what we choose to put out there is what people would hear about us. In a recent discussion with some of my colleagues, I tried to find out what being Ghanaian and African meant to them and how they thought they were being represented on huge media platforms. Now, most people said they were proud about the rich cultural heritage and the country's vibrant democratic credentials. A few of them have admitted a feeling of slight inferiority. They hoped that a better representation was made of the continent. And this made me appreciate why we should not be victims of the business of news. On the other hand, my experiences from being here in the UK have made me more vulnerable to some of these experiences. You know, sometimes you meet people who sympathize with you even before they get to know who you are, where you're from, what you do. A clear indication was an example of my landlord earlier on. Now, Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie reminds me of how I come from a world or a culture that is not well represented, that's not well understood, where people can literally attempt to tell you who you are, which is obviously who they think I am. And this starts to and she puts it clearly in her TED Talk in 2009 titled The Dangers of a Single Story. In it, she narrates and shares her experience of how her American roommates felt sorry for her and sympathized with her even before she got to know who she was. She had a rather interesting way of describing her experience, patronizing, well-meaning pity. Why? Because she was from Africa. Now, I believe that as Africans, if we are of the view that we are being misrepresented, then it's up to us to change the narrative and influence what the world thinks about us. This can be done through popular media or even social media advocacy. And that could be one way to start it, putting out alternative stories out there, correcting the erroneous reports from Ghana and of Africa as a continent at large, rebranding ourselves, our country, and ultimately our continent. So earlier this year, media giant CNN incurred the wrath of many Ghanaians, following a misleading article that was written about Ghana after our country's general elections in December 2016. The article headlined, "Ghana elected incumbent concedes to Nana Akufo-Addo." It described the country's political happenings and how former President John Dramani Mahama conceded defeat. Now, what angered most Ghanaians was a part of the article that stated that Ghanaians are still struggling to obtain food and day-to-day activities, and citizens often stand in long queues to obtain products. This was countered strongly with a social media campaign to correct that and other inaccuracies in the article. The coverage was unfair, yes, it was totally exaggerated, and soon as CNN gets it right trended on Twitter. Now, this compelled the CNN to change the part of the story that promoted these ideas And generally, there was an editor's note which said that the stores were generally stocked in food. So what this goes to show is the impact of arguments, the impact of putting out campaigns there to correct these ideas. Now, speaking of correcting the inaccuracies, maybe one small mistake at a time could go a long way to change the narrative. And so I believe that as journalists, we should be trained on the history of Africa. I believe also that as journalists, we should have a social responsibility to our audience to report true and accurate stories that reflect the whole picture and not parts that favor the narrative. This emphasized by Mezana in 2009, where he made some recommendations on the need for Western media organizations to train their journalists through training courses and also train African journalists in special courses to revive cultural identity and social responsibility. Now, a famous Ghanaian proverb goes that if you're climbing a good tree, there will always be somebody to give you a push. If you're pursuing a course worthy of encouragement, you will always find someone who would encourage you and urge you on. It must start through conversations. It must start in social media, empowering journalists to appreciate the African heritage and history, like I'm trying to do now. This has been Letters from Ghana.